Hi, Paul. Thank you so much for coming on to Everyday Endorphins. It's so great to have you here.
Hey, Stella, thanks for inviting me on. It was great to meet you about a month ago or so at the Eudaimonia Summit in West Palm Beach.
I know that was, first of all, such a great 3 days. I can't wait to go back next year. I'm so happy that they have this summit going on for the next few years. And it was just like such a cool opportunity to get to meet a lot of like minded people in the wellness and like longevity community. And what I really appreciated about it was there were a lot of different people kind of representing, let's say, different areas of wellness or different pillars of wellness. And what I loved most about your talk is kind of how controversial like the subject matter was, which is around like psychedelics and microdosing and demystifying all of that. And so I think it gave like a really unique perspective, especially as I was going to the different discussions and like panels, because I was kind of thinking about like maybe more traditional areas of, what we consider to be like healthy practices versus more emerging areas of research that I feel like we're going to talk about later today. But I really appreciated the exposure and like the time dedicated towards demystifying a lot of the work in the microdosing space that you're very well versed in.
Yeah, microdosing has been something that I've been both practicing and studying for about 10 years now, since 2015. It's a pretty new topic. It really only became a thing in 2010, 2011. Psychedelics have been talked about and have been used for thousands of years even, but microdosing in and of itself is a fairly new practice. And so what I even emphasized in that talk is the research is still quite nascent. There's a lot of promising anecdotal reports around people who are microdosing and how it's helping them. And we have a lot of clinical research about psychedelics more broadly, typically therapeutic doses or macro doses of psychedelics when used within a therapeutic context. However, because microdosing is so nascent and because psychedelics are still very illegal, it means that research has been slow going. So there's some things we know. There's quite a lot of that we don't know. And my job is to help us to generate clarity on kind of based on what we know and based on what we don't know, how can we best practice this so, we're safe while we do it, but it's also effective and it's useful and it helps to move the needle for us on our own path of healing and growth.
And I know you talked about there being different entry points into dabbling into this space, but I want to backtrack a little and have you share what your entry point was. What got you interested in microdosing and psychedelics at large? How have you seen it benefit your life? And what was kind of that catalyst for you deciding to really experiment in this space?
I first got into psychedelics when I was 19. So I'm 34. About 15 years ago, I went to a small liberal arts college in West Michigan called Hope College. And before we went live, we found out that you and I had the same professor, which is crazy small world. And at that school, my sophomore year of college, I experimented with psilocybin mushrooms. And then about 5 months after that, I experimented with LSD. LSD, I loved. That experience, it was really like before and after LSD. Like it just really fundamentally changed me as a human. And I grew up in a community that was pretty conservative, Midwest, small town, religious. Drugs, especially illegal drugs, were not necessarily looked upon lightly. And my parents, in fact, when I was in high school, had discovered that I had smoked cannabis and it like wrecked their perspective of me for probably a month or so. They just could not believe that I would ever smoke an illegal drug like marijuana. So I was coming into it from a context of this really isn't an acceptable thing to do. This really isn't an appropriate thing to do, but I'm a rebel at heart. And so my best friend at the time in high school and then college introduced me to both cannabis and psilocybin mushrooms. And what I noticed when I would have these experiences is the experiences themselves were really positive, really beautiful. But more importantly, after the experience, I noticed that I was, a little more patient. I was more connected. It was easier for me to really open up and connect because I've always had a little bit of social anxiety. It was easier to be mindful about the food that I was eating and how often I was exercising. So I just noticed that I was willing to take better care of myself. And so soon after graduating from undergrad, I was living in Thailand, building my first online business, and I noticed that there were these podcasts that were coming out about microdosing. There was one in particular, the Tim Ferriss podcast, where a guy named Jim Fadiman came on and talked about microdosing. And I thought back to those experiences that I had had with LSD when I was, 19 or 20 and thought, oh, cool. Like maybe microdosing is a way to elongate what I would call the afterglow. So after a high dose experience for 2 or 3 weeks after that high dose experience, life just feels a little easier. And I figured, okay, maybe if I start to microdose actively, that could extend, and it might feel easier for a longer period of time. So when I was 25, I started to microdose, and I microdosed for about 7 months, twice a week with LSD. And I had two main intentions with that microdosing protocol. One was to reduce, if not eliminate, the alcohol that I was drinking. And then the second one was more specific to entrepreneurship. I wanted to spend more time in a flow state and have better focus and overall productivity. And so I started to experiment with microdosing, and it was so impactful. And I found it to be so interesting that I decided to start an educational platform around both microdosing and broadly psychedelics called Third Wave. And so now for the last almost 10 years, I've been professionally involved in the psychedelic space. And through our educational platform, we've helped to inform millions of people about kind of the pros and cons of psychedelics. And I've guided thousands of people through experiences, macro experiences. And now I'm really focused on training coaches, practitioners, doctors, clinicians, and how to work with psychedelics.
It's such an emerging area of research as well. So I feel like that's what a perfect time to get into this space and to really dedicate your professional life towards. And you mentioned earlier at the time when you were like just kind of getting started into a specific protocol, the reasons why you were doing it were twofold. First, reduce your alcohol intake. Secondly, interested in experiencing more sort of that like flow state as an entrepreneur in that path. So it seems like intentionality around actually going through a protocol is really important. How would you coach people if they're interested in getting into psychedelics and more so microdosing? How would you advise people to even think about intentionality or like what that serves when you're deciding I want to experiment with microdosing?
So one can make the case that regardless of whether or not you're taking psychedelics or taking microdoses of psychedelics, that intentionality is important, right? Like it's important to live intentionally, to know how it is that you want to design your lifestyle, to be aware of the choices that you are making, to be clear on why you were choosing what you were choosing to whatever to do, whether that's a relationship, or whether that's a career, or, where you're going for lunch or dinner. Intentionality is really important. When we start to work with psychedelics, even at these lower doses, like a microdose, what it does is it makes it so that we have an easier time manifesting the intention that we have. In other words, the gap between what we want and what we're able to create tends to reduce. And that's because when we work with microdoses of psychedelics, it's helping to facilitate neuroplasticity, right? And neuroplasticity is the capacity for the brain to adapt and change, for old neuronal connections that have sort of died away to be reactivated. And when the brain is more plastic and the brain is more malleable, we can better change our behaviors to fit the intention or the context that we've set for ourselves. So having that clear intention then allows us to direct the energy that is moving through us because of the psychedelics into more of a productive outcome. If we don't have that intention, then the energy that's moving through is a bit more, it's like we're shooting from the hip. You could easily spin off, to the left or easily spin off to the right. And so we want to keep it as centered and as focused as possible. And so that intention is something we consistently come back to. And it's the anchor of that microdosing protocol and that microdosing experience. There's a few different ways that you can think about intentions. You can think about intentions the day of. You can think about intentions for a protocol, which we can talk more about what that protocol would entail. Or you could also think about intentions more broadly in terms of in 2025 or, the next 3 years of your life or the next 5 years of your life. So, and typically for like a microdose or microdosing protocol, that sweet spot is usually 4 to 6 weeks. So usually when I work with folks or I'm advising clients that I'm working with, it really is, okay, if you could accomplish one thing in the next 6 weeks, what would that be? Or if you could shift one behavior in the next 6 weeks, what would that be? And then looking at how microdosing can support that overall process.
It seems also like microdosing is perhaps maybe just another tool in someone's toolkit for working through something that they want to improve in their life. So maybe it's not the idea that we rely on these substances to make that change and to like engage in that protocol, quote unquote, forever, but more so it's tapping into that structure for a specific period of time as like a methodology to kind of help you get through whatever change you want to make in your life, using it as like something that you can leverage and kind of pull from your toolbox when you need it, rather than feeling like you need to rely on it. And I think this might be addressing maybe one of those misconceptions around psychedelics being addictive versus like non-addictive substances. I think that's probably a big fear that a lot of people have when they're contemplating like, should I try it or should I not? Like that's maybe some sort of roadblock around like the addictive or lack of addictive quality to a lot of these substances.
Right. Because when people think of psychedelics, they naturally think, okay, this is a drug. This drug is illegal. All the other illegal drugs that I know of are highly addictive and clearly lead to, potential issues or problems. The most common ones, of course, being heroin or fentanyl or cocaine or crystal meth or even ecstasy sometimes can be this way, right? So a lot of people think, okay, if it's a drug and it's illegal, then it must be highly addictive. And what's true is psychedelics are actually anti-addictive. We have clinical research out of places like NYU and Johns Hopkins that proves how psychedelics help to heal addiction. And so when we're talking about microdosing in particular, microdosing is the act of taking a very low dose of a psychedelic. LSD or psilocybin mushrooms are the two most common psychedelics, and doing it 2 or 3 times a week for a period of 4 to 6 weeks. And so a big question around that then is, well, if I start doing this consistently, doesn't that mean that I'm going to become addicted to it because it's a drug? And what's important to emphasize is that's not the case at all. This isn't like an SSRI, or this isn't like, an ADHD, a medication for ADHD. There are no withdrawal symptoms when you stop doing it. And that's because these are largely active on serotonin rather than dopamine. And so because they're largely active on serotonin, you don't have these physiological withdrawals. So you can microdose 2 or 3 times a week for 4 weeks straight or 6 weeks straight, or what I did it 7 months straight, which I wouldn't recommend, but I was a guinea pig at that point in time. And there weren't a lot of best practices out there. I also just really love LSD. So I just kept going with it. And I stopped one day, and I stopped for like 5 months, and there was no problem, no withdrawals, no issues whatsoever. So from a physiological perspective, there's really no tendency for addiction. Now, the other consideration is psychologically, because it is a drug. And psychologically, some people will notice, okay, I really do feel better now that I'm microdosing. My mood is better. I have more energy. I'm getting better sleep. I'm more sort of emotionally connected or kind of in my feeling body. And they'll, go, okay, the reason I'm feeling this way is because I've started to microdose. And their worry is, okay, if I stop microdosing, will these good feelings go away? And so typically what I advise or coach individuals through is microdosing is not a magic pill, it's a catalyst. When we have a microdosing protocol, the intention should be to commit to some new practice or habit. So to start meditating consistently, to shift our diet, to break up with a toxic partner, to quit a toxic job. There should be some sort of intentional action that we are taking as part of that microdosing protocol that we know will benefit us in the long term as well. And that way, when we decide that we do want to stop microdosing, whether that's for a week or a month or maybe even a year, we do have a practice that has been integrated that will continue to serve us in the long term. And that, I think it's your point about, it's not just about taking this drug or this pill necessarily. It really is looking at the process of microdosing as a catalyst. And we still have to show up. We still have to do the work. We still have to commit to the change that we want to see in our lives.
Absolutely. Like any other type of solution or like tool that we can use to improve our well-being. There was something you said in particular at the Eudaimonia Summit that really kind of caught my eye. And you had mentioned that microdosing is not really a quick fix for like any sort of mental health issue. Rather, it's important to think about how this practice can be used as a synergistic modality. And I thought that was a really interesting way to describe it. Can you share a little bit more on what you mean by using psychedelics as synergistic modality, how that helps to not be this quick fix, but rather something that you can use for a healing journey in a way?
When we think of drugs like psychedelics, we think, okay, this is the tool and it's the only tool. And whether or not this is helpful is going to be dependent strictly on the substance that I'm taking, right? Now, the risk with that is we're still looking then for help outside of ourselves. Sometimes that help is necessary. We need a kick in the pants. We need something that gets us up and out of our rut. We need some pharmacological support. And psychedelics are ancient medicines. We've been using them thousands of years. They're shown to be very safe, very effective, very useful. All these things are true. At the same time, it's really important that we have these endogenous practices as well. So oftentimes, as part of a microdosing protocol, people will, on their microdosing day, they'll meditate and commit to a meditation practice. One of my favorite things to do while microdosing is breath work and hot cold thermogenesis, which is a really fancy way of saying go in the sauna and jump in the cold plunge, right? Other people will microdose and go hiking, or what I call hikerdosing. They'll take a microdose, a low dose, and they'll go for a long hike, and they notice that it gets the ideas going. It helps with energy. They can go hiking for longer, all these sorts of things. So I think that that's the beautiful part about working with these lower doses of psychedelics, is they can easily be combined with other practices to have this synergistic effect. Because if you're just microdosing or you're just meditating, those are great practices in and of themselves. But if you put them together, the microdosing will deepen the meditation, and the meditation will allow you to be more sensitive and aware to what is coming up as you're microdosing. There's an attunement process that is facilitated. And it goes back to what I was saying before. This also allows us then to know that the practice itself is just as beneficial as the drug. Because we are so conditioned, especially in modernity, to rely on pills, we really want to make sure that if we're starting a microdosing protocol or stepping into microdosing, it doesn't replicate a lot of the same sort of mindset or perspectives that just taking Prozac or Lexapro or Ritalin or Adderall or just popping a pill to see if it fixes us helps. What I often emphasize is we are not machines to be fixed. We are human beings that are complex creatures. And so psychedelics help us to understand that complexity and navigate that complexity without cutting off certain aspects and elements of who we are. So when looking at microdosing, definitely commit to having some other practice that you combine with it. So there's not this tendency to fall in the trap of, okay, the only reason I'm feeling better is because I'm taking this drug. No, the drug is helping. It's a catalyst, but it's not the only thing. You also have these practices that you can lean on.
Exactly. And breath work, meditation, hot, cold exposure, those are all things that I think are really foundational towards like keeping yourself in some sort of equilibrium. I know for myself, like when I do breath work, it feels kind of like a psychedelic experience, even if I'm not on any sort of drug. Like you feel kind of like you're in this altered state. The bodily sensations that you feel, your arms or legs tingling, sometimes I get this like head high, like these are all very much like natural highs, even through hot and cold exposure, especially going right into the cold plunge. Like I get an immediate head rush. And what I found to be really helpful, specifically with those practices and meditation included, is that you're kind of training your brain. And this goes back to neuroplasticity, what you mentioned earlier. You're training your brain to like signal safety in your body, even when you're in an unsafe environment. And life is challenging, and we're complex human beings, and we experience a wide range of very complex human emotions. And I think a lot of the times we kind of get stuck in these really negative emotions, like downward spirals, because we're kind of like re-triggering ourselves, thinking that we're not safe. But learning to come back to this sense of inner safety and creating that sensation within the body, I think is such an important skill to have really around like regulating oneself. So it seems like these microdosing practices and protocols, when you're combining it with the breath work, the cold plunge, whatever, it's kind of used to really enhance the benefits that you're already getting out of those practices.
Yeah, that sense of enhancement, right? I love that word, to enhance or to amplify, that it really is in addition to, it's not exclusively just the substance itself. I think the enhancement properties of these low doses of psychedelics are fantastic and in many ways under-researched and underexplored. And yet what I've heard from countless humans and individuals is that the way it enhances their mood or the way it enhances their energy levels or enhances their sleep, right? All these things folks are finding as they're starting to microdose.
You made a comment also during the eudaimonia talk, and I'd need to pull up my notes to find exactly where it fell during your conversation, but I think it kind of like got a little bit of a joke out of the crowd, but there was so much truth to it. And you kind of made this comment about how psychedelic experiences kind of help us face our ego. And like men really need to check their ego. And I definitely found that entertaining because there's a lot of truth to it. But I wanted to kind of talk a little bit more about more so kind of like the spiritual, psychological effects from doing these types of protocols and doing the work to go a bit more inwards. Specifically, the comment that you made around how these substances kind of help us face our egos. So when you think about like a microdosing experience or even just taking the normal dose of it and kind of going through that journey, can you kind of walk us through like what that revelation could kind of look like on the inside? Like, what does it mean to say that these experiences can kind of help us face our ego? Like, what does that look like? How does the ego kind of play into a lot of the roadblocks that we face in our lives? Like, this is abstracting a little bit more towards like a spiritual perspective, but I do think it's really intertwined with a lot of what you're talking about.
We could think of the ego as the separate self, right? And part of the beauty of Western individualism is recognizing the fact that we have individual choice, that we have individual agency, that we can choose to live in a certain way. And we identify a lot then with that personality that we've constructed over the span of our existence and our life. And so in many ways, the ego it's neither bad nor good. It's just everyone has one, and we have to figure out how to work with it. However, many people have what might be called ego myopia, where they can't see beyond their ego, where they have to protect their ego. And so I think the beautiful part about psychedelics and their ego-dissolving properties is they allow us to experience something subjectively where we feel deeply connected to everything around us. We are no longer just stuck in this separate sense of self, the I, but especially when taking high doses of psychedelics, they dissolve the ego and they allow us to feel deeply connected to everything around us. And that deep sense of connection to the we, this feeling of interconnectedness that psychedelics often facilitate, the anchoring in that can often lead to much healthier decision making because there's a recognition that every action or decision that I make has an impact on those around me. And that's pretty essential for change, and behavioral change, especially shifting or changing behaviors that may be dysfunctional or that may be not healthy, right? And you could think of that as alcoholism. You could think of that as smoking cigarettes. You could think of that as being impatient or speaking rudely. There's a lot of different ways that you could organize sort of dysfunctional behaviors. And the ego has a way of wanting to continue itself and to protect itself. So when we take a psychedelic, we're able to see, like these are all the ways in which I'm hurting myself. This is sometimes why I have been doing this. And now I have a choice that I can shift and change it. And so the beautiful part about microdosing is that microdosing allows you to continue to keep the ego a little less rigid, right? When the high dose comes in, it totally interrupts the rigidity. It's working on something called the default mode network. So the default mode network is sort of our default practices and patterns and behaviors. Those often become very rigid. And so when people are depressed or anxious or have issues with addiction or things, they feel stuck in a rut, it's usually because that default mode has become too constricted. And so you put a psychedelic in there and it opens up, introduces chaos, right? It opens up the capacity for that thing to change. And then when you microdose after those high dose experiences, it keeps it open, which can be really positive and beneficial because you want to keep yourself out of falling into a default mode, has been my understanding. Right? The more time that we can spend in a space of liminality, a space of not knowing, a space of uncertainty, the richer that space is for real true growth and transformation. Whenever we start to fall into the same patterns, the same ruts, the same behaviors again and again and again, almost on default, without a lot of choice and agency, that's when our ego often becomes too constrictive and too tight. So psychedelics help to introduce that. And the reason I even made that comment about men versus women is men tend to have a stronger egoic sense of self, for better and for worse. What was true is in a lot of indigenous communities, they would have specific things called rites of passage, where men would be brought through, boys would be brought through really intense experiences that would essentially kill their ego. Sometimes those were psychedelic induced, but sometimes they were go live in the wild for a month. Or one in Africa, there are these things called bullet ants, and boys would put their hands in gloves full of bullet ants and they'd have to keep it in there. And so the pain was insane. And so the idea with these rites of passage is you bring the boy into a subjective experience where he can see outside of his own individual needs. And I think that's what we're missing nowadays is a lot of men are just out for themselves. A lot of people in business are just out for themselves. They have a hard time really seeing beyond their own needs with an eye. And I think having an experience with psychedelics allows you to see the value of really being in stewardship and in service to something greater than ourselves.
When we feel a sense of connection to something outside of ourselves, when we feel like there's a greater sense of purpose and meaning in our lives, like that is a fundamental pillar to our health and to our well-being. Like psychedelics aside, that is just a fact. Like when we feel a sense of connection to other people, that is kind of like the common denominator that a lot of these other like wellness pillars rest on. If we don't feel a sense of connection, if we isolate ourselves, we're less likely to make healthier choices. We're more likely to, to spiral into some sort of depressive state. If we're in a depressive state, we're probably not eating well, or we're not getting enough rest or restful sleep. It's very cyclical and everything kind of builds on one another, especially living kind of right now in this mental health epidemic and also experiencing this loneliness crisis that a lot of people, are kind of collectively facing. I think now more than ever, it's incredibly important to recognize that connection and community is really critical and like pivotal towards our well-being, right? And with this podcast, Everyday Endorphins, the whole premise of the show is about anchoring onto the things that bring us joy, finding things in life that make us happy. And a lot of that is rooted in like having a strong sense of self and feeling really connected to other people. And what's interesting too, kind of back to your point around the ego, when we do think about our sense of self, like you mentioned earlier, that's like a stronger sense of self, however you phrased it. But really, I do think that when we're able to kind of de-identify from the ego, but recognize it is a part of us, we're able to build that stronger, like holistic sense of self. And therefore also are more easily able to actually connect with other people. So it does seem like, back to what we were talking about even earlier, psychedelics, microdosing, not microdosing, engaging with, the drug, however you do choose, is a way to get closer to that sense of self by kind of deconstructing the ego a little bit. And were there any pivotal moments in your life that like you saw this kind of loud and clear that was a signal to you that the work that you were doing in these protocols were actually in service of you becoming closer to yourself, having a stronger sense of self, improving other parts of your life and your well-being at large? Like, were there any particular moments that resonated with you and were like, oh, yeah, this is the work that's being done?
I think that's been sort of the consistent unfolding since I started working with psychedelics many years ago, that I have, for the most part, always used them as a way to explore and understand and generate more awareness and self-awareness. That when I started working with them at the age of 19 and 20, they really started to set me down this path of quote unquote self-improvement. So really taking a keener eye to meditation and, entrepreneurship and living like a nomad in my 20s and, what I could do there. So there was always a sense of they helped me to recognize and see the parts of myself that in normal waking consciousness I didn't necessarily want to look at or see. And then both love and honor, but also shift some of those ways and practices and behaviors. And I will say, kind of what I've learned along the path in the last 15 years is there are still, this endpoint of perfection is not reachable. There are aspects of who we are that cannot be fundamentally changed. And we just have to learn how to work with them in a way that is much healthier. So a really good example of this, and this would not be me personally, but a really good example of this is like someone who's an alcoholic, right? They clean up their alcoholism. They're no longer an alcoholic. They're sober, but there's an intensity that came with that alcoholism or that addiction that they now have to channel into something else, right? And so I think psychedelics open up a path of awareness. They do allow us to shift and change how we show up, to become less reactive and more responsive, to be more aware of the choices that we are making, to be more clear about what it is that we want to create. But there's still a certain truth of who we are that can be difficult to fully overcome. And that's why we as humans, we are imperfect. And also why we as humans always look to be in community or in partnership, because we recognize that only by being in relationship with others can we reach a point in life that feels like it's a balance and harmony. That if we're just consistently navel gazing and focused on self-care and focused on self-love and focused on me, then there will always be a really sort of tragic gap in our ability to live. And so I think when we think about psychedelics and bringing us out of that navel gazing, they help us to recognize that at the end of the day, all life is about relating and relationships and how we relate and the value of those relationships. And we so oftentimes put other things, prioritize other things ahead of that. And we almost always pay the price if we do. So it kind of just brings me often back to that first principle of have people you love, connect with people you love, spend the time that you want to spend with them. I'm still introverted, so I still spend a lot of time alone or doing my own thing, but it really helped me to see the value in relationships and being as relational as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would argue it's actually hard to want to engage in that when you personally don't feel really good about yourself, when you personally are struggling. It's really hard to show up for other people when you don't even know how to show up for yourself or you're not treating yourself well. So in a way, it still does come back to the self, but the intention is to spread the love, like to fill your cup up so that you can spread it and share it with others. And I think this is a really great transition into kind of the last topic that I wanted to discuss, which is really around joy and happiness and finding things in life that bring endorphins. So my first question to you, I'm curious to hear if you have a bespoke definition around happiness, how you define happiness, how does that differentiate from joy, if it does at all, if any psychedelic experiences for you kind of brought you to some sort of aha moment where you were like, oh, I thought this was happiness, but it's really not.
I was fortunate enough that I started my psychedelic experience at a young age. So the most common trope that we might hear is, oh, I thought, having more cars or having more money or, having more accomplishments would make me happy. I never really went through that stage. I was born into a very frugal, middle class, small town family. And so I kind of got ahead of the curve when I did all these psychedelics at 19 and 20. So for me, that was really what I sort of lean into is, at least in my 20s, happiness is found in exploration. Happiness is found in freedom. Happiness is found in choice. Happiness is found in what I now term or phrase existential wealth. It's the wealth of existence. It's not necessarily the wealth in our bank account or the wealth of the cars that we own or the wealth of the job that we have or whatever it might be. So I think existential wealth, the wealth of existing, and what's in that? Well, meaning, as we've talked about, and fulfillment is in that. Relationships is in that. Physiological health is in that. Psychological health is in that. Having a career or a job or a profession that we really love is part of that. So I think happiness is multivariate. There's a lot of aspects that go into happiness. If you have great physical health, but you don't have great relationships, you're probably not going to be happy. If you have great relationships, but you don't have great physical health, you're probably not going to be happy. So I think we have to look at bringing all of those into sort of a coherent sense of harmony. I think joy is much more of a temporary state. I mean, that's the main distinction between happiness and joy. Joy, bliss, awe, these are states that are important to experience. But if you're in a state of joy all the time, every day, life is going to be, I think, challenging to navigate. We need to be grounded sometimes. We need to kind of look at things with a clear perspective. I think people who are constantly in a state of joy or bliss can be easily manipulated. So happiness is much more tangible. It's much more sustainable. And it requires integrating, I think, a lot of practices that are not just in the short term, but also in the long term. I mean, maybe you've had a guest on the podcast who's talked about this prior, but this really interesting study where they give two young children like a marshmallow, and they basically said, you can either eat this now or you can wait. I think it was like 2 minutes or 5 minutes or something to eat it. And the ones that waited, the ones that showed delayed gratification, ended up being much more successful in the long term and much more happy in the long term. And so I think delayed gratification is also a key aspect of happiness, that we have to learn to both enjoy the present moment, be of the present moment, but also integrate the necessary practices and commit to doing the necessary work so we can build a life that we really truly value and enjoy and are happy in.
Oh, 100%. That's so well articulated. I've definitely talked about the concept of delayed gratification on the show before with other guests, but you're really bringing me back to my college days studying neuroscience with the default mode network and that study with the marshmallow and neuroplasticity, because it is all very much rooted in not only scientific findings and principles, but also ancient wisdom. Like, truly it is. And we tend to overcomplicate a lot of things in our life, but it's really like going back to the basics and tying it back to microdosing. Like, perhaps that's one practice, one way in which you can have more ease and like patience in your life so that you can more easily access delayed gratification. The final question I will leave you with is, what brings you endorphins, Paul? What is something that just brings you incremental joy, lights you up every day?
That's a good question. Lately, it's usually sunshine. I live in San Diego. We were talking about this before we went live. So getting enough sunshine on a day-to-day basis, being outside, going to the beach, getting my feet in the sand, making sure I'm going for walks and moving and being outside. That's one. Two, exercise. Exercise always does it for me. The last few months, I've settled down a little bit more, and I've been going to the gym 3, 4, 5 times a week. And for the first time in my life, working with a personal trainer, and that's been fantastic. So just like pushing myself and lifting heavy weights and making sure I'm going to the gym consistent has really helped with my endorphins. And I think just, this act of gratitude and practicing gratitude and carving out the necessary time to really reflect on how grateful I am. Those, I think, are like the 3 practices: sunlight, exercise, and gratitude that I commit to on a consistent basis that help to keep my endorphins high. The dopamine, the norepinephrine, all the good things going.
I love it. Gratitude, especially, it keeps you actually very grounded in the present moment. A quote that I heard recently is, be right where your feet are. Just leave that there, because the more I thought about it, I was like, wow, why is my brain 3 months ago when my feet are currently right here? So it's something to think about. I mean, gratitude helps you think a little bit more critically about that. But I loved everything you had to share, Paul. Thank you again so much for coming on. Where can my listeners connect with you, follow along everything that you're doing, and also check out Third Wave?
Yeah, Third Wave, the thirdwave.co, or just putting Google Third Wave, microdosing, Third Wave psychedelics. We have our own podcast, a newsletter, programs and courses that we run, including a microdosing experience and a training program for coaches and practitioners. So that's thethirdwave.co. And then I post on social quite a bit. So I'm at Paul Austin 3W on Instagram and Twitter for the most part. So if anyone here is on social, reach out, connect, say hi, send me a DM. And then my personal website is paulaustin.co. And you can find everything else there. So thank you for having me on, Stella. It was really fun to be able to chat and be on Everyday Endorphins. And yeah, I had a really great time going deep with you today.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Paul.